Colorado Territory, high in the San Juan Mountains, October of 1870. The first snows had already dusted the peaks, a stark white warning against the deep blue of the autumn sky. Down in the narrow valley, the small mining settlement of Providence Gulch was a hive of frantic activity. Men were chinking logs, stacking firewood into prodigious walls, and hauling the last of the season's supplies from the nearest town, a brutal 3-day ride away. Everyone was preparing for war, a war against the cold. Everyone, that is, except for Elias Thorne. He was engaged in a different kind of labor, one that earned him nothing but scorn and worried glances. While others split oak and pine, Elias moved snow. With a crude wooden shovel, he was piling it into a single, enormous mound on the flattest part of his claim, just upwind from his meager, drafty cabin. He worked with a quiet, relentless rhythm, his movements economical, his face unreadable. He wasn't just shoveling, he was packing, stomping, shaping the growing mass with a strange, deliberate care. The other men, taking a break from their sensible work, would watch him. They saw a man building a house out of the very thing that would kill them. It was madness, a profound, unsettling foolishness. They had a name for his creation, whispered first at the trading post and then spoken openly with mocking laughter. They called it Thorne's Tomb. By the end of the month, the mound was immense, a smooth, white dome rising 12 feet high and nearly 30 feet across. It looked like a giant, unnatural blister on the landscape. And then, Elias Thorne simply stopped. He went about his other chores, leaving the great pile of snow to sit, silent and absurd, under the hardening sky. He was waiting. What did this quiet outsider, a man who had failed to find gold, understand about survival that every calloused, experienced frontiersman in that valley had missed? They believed they were looking at the architecture of a slow, frozen suicide. They were wrong. They were looking at the architecture of salvation. If you want to understand the forgotten physics that can turn a killer into a protector, you need to subscribe to this channel and follow this story to its unbelievable conclusion. Drop a comment and tell us the coldest temperature you've ever experienced. To understand Elias Thorne's strange project, you must first understand the enemy. Winter in the high Rockies was not a season. It was a siege. It arrived not with gentle grace, but as an invading army. The cold was a physical entity, a predator that stalked the valleys. It was a pressure that found every crack in a cabin's wall, every gap in the daubing. It was a weight that pressed down on the roofs, and a thief that stole the warmth from a man's very bones. The settlers of Providence Gulch were not naive. They were hard people, accustomed to hardship. They built their cabins the way their fathers had, with thick interlocking logs, stone fireplaces, and sod roofs. These were structures of proven design, honed by generations of experience in the forests of Ohio and the hills of Appalachia. But the Rockies were a different beast. The air here was thin and dry, and the altitude meant the temperature could plummet 50 degrees between sunset and midnight. The conventional cabin was a fortress with a fatal flaw: its thermal inefficiency. Wood, for all its strength, is a relatively poor insulator. A log wall, no matter how thick, constantly leaked heat into the abyss of the mountain night. The stone chimneys were even worse, acting as massive conduits, sucking precious warm air out of the cabin and replacing it with drafts of Arctic cold. Life inside these cabins during the deep winter was a grim cycle of labor and shivering. Families would burn through catastrophic amounts of firewood. A man might spend his entire day felling, bucking, and splitting timber, only to feed it all into a roaring fire that barely kept the cabin's interior above freezing. The heat was concentrated in a small, scorching radius around the hearth. Move 10 feet away, and your breath would fog in the air. The sensory details of that suffering were etched into the memory of every resident. It was the sight of a rime of frost forming on the inside of the cabin walls, sparkling in the lamplight. It was the sound of the wind shrieking through the timbers, a constant, malevolent howl. It was the feeling of sleeping blankets stiff with frozen condensation by morning. Ink froze in its wells. Water barrels had to be kept close to the fire, or they would split open, solid as granite. Children were especially vulnerable. They were bundled in so many layers they could barely move, their faces chapped and raw. The constant, insidious dampness, a byproduct of breath and melting snow in a poorly ventilated space, led to relentless coughs and lung fevers that could carry a child off in a matter of days. Survival was not a given. It was a battle won inch by inch, cord by cord, day by agonizing day. This was the brutal reality that formed the foundation of their conventional wisdom. They fought the cold with fire and wood because it was the only way they knew. Elias Thorne knew another way. He was not a native of the mountains. He had come from the east, a bookish young man caught up in the promise of gold. But before he had come west, his life had taken a detour that had reshaped his understanding of the world. As a young man, he had signed on to a whaling vessel bound for the Arctic. The expedition had been a disaster. The ship was trapped in the ice of the Baffin Bay, and the crew was forced to overwinter with a local Inuit community. For the sailors, it was a terrifying ordeal. For Elias, it was a profound education. He watched the Inuit not just survive, but thrive. In a landscape of unimaginable cold, they lived without a single tree for firewood, in a world made entirely of snow and ice. Their secret was the igloo, a structure that defied every principle of construction he had ever known. He learned that his hosts did not fear snow. They revered it. They understood it not as an enemy, but as the world's greatest building material. An elder, a man named Uta, had taught him. He had shown Elias how fresh snow was full of air, millions of tiny pockets trapped between the ice crystals. This trapped air was the key. It was a near-perfect insulator, far superior to wood or stone. Uta had demonstrated how to build with it, cutting blocks from wind-packed drifts and spiraling them into a self-supporting dome. But more importantly, he had explained the physics of life inside. Elias learned that the structure was a system. A low, sunken entrance trapped the cold air, which was heavier than warm air, in a cold sink. A raised sleeping platform allowed the inhabitants to live in the bubble of warmer air that collected at the top. A small hole in the roof provided ventilation, preventing the buildup of carbon dioxide and moisture. The heat from a small seal oil lamp and their own bodies was enough to raise the interior temperature to a comfortable level, often a staggering 60 or 70 degrees warmer than the outside air. The inner walls would melt slightly and then refreeze into a hard, impermeable shell of ice, strengthening the structure and preventing drips. This knowledge had lain dormant in him for years, but now, in the high Rockies, faced with the same existential threat of cold, it had resurfaced. He saw the mountains of snow not as a burden to be shoveled away, but as an untapped resource. He knew he could not build a traditional igloo. The snow here was different, softer, and less consolidated than the wind-blasted slabs of the Arctic. So he would use a different but related technique he had also observed, the quinji. He would create his own building material. He began in early November after the first 2 heavy snowfalls. The great mound he had piled now sat for 2 weeks, untouched. This was the most crucial and least understood step. He was allowing the snow to sinter. Under its own weight and through the fluctuations of daytime sun and nighttime frost, the snow crystals were metamorphosing. They were losing their delicate, feathery shapes, bonding together, forming a dense, cohesive mass. He was letting nature temper his raw material. When he judged the time was right, he began to dig. He started not at the base, but a few feet up, carving a low, narrow tunnel that angled downwards before turning up into the heart of the mound. This was the cold sink, the invisible door that would keep the warmth in and the cold out. The work was slow and arduous. He hauled out the excavated snow on a sled, dumping it far away from the entrance. After days of tunneling, he broke through into the center and began the real work of hollowing out the living chamber. He worked by the light of a single lantern, his world reduced to a shimmering white cavern. He shaped the interior into a perfect dome, a form of incredible, inherent strength. He knew from his time in the north that a curved arch distributes weight evenly, preventing any single point from bearing too much stress. As he worked, Silas Blackwood came to visit. Silas was the Gulch's master builder, a man whose opinion carried the weight of authority. He had built nearly every sound structure in the valley, his axe, and saw a familiar part of the landscape. He was a good man, respected by all, and he came not out of malice, but genuine concern. He stood at the entrance of the tunnel, his tall frame stooped, his face a mask of worried disbelief. "Elias Thorne?" he said, his voice echoing strangely in the snow. "What is this you're doing? I've stayed quiet, but this has gone on long enough. You have a wife and 2 small children in that drafty cabin. Winter is here. This is no time for experiments." Elias emerged from the tunnel, blinking in the daylight, his eyebrows caked with snow. "I'm building our winter house, Silas." Silas gestured at the mound with a gloved hand, his frustration evident. "This is not a house. It's a pile of snow. The first heavy, wet storm will collapse it and bury you all. The weight alone is a danger. There are no beams, no supports. It defies all logic." "The shape is the support," Elias replied calmly. "It's stronger than you think." "And the damp?" Silas pressed, his argument sound, based on a lifetime of experience. "Your body heat, your cooking fire, it will all turn this place into a dripping cave of ice. It will soak your bedding, your clothes. It will put a fever in your children's lungs before Christmas. We lose 2 or 3 little ones to lung fever every winter in good dry cabins. What do you think will happen in here?" It was a powerful, logical argument. Everyone knew the danger of damp cold. It was a killer, more insidious than dry cold. This was the point that resonated most with the onlookers, who had gathered at a respectful distance. Elias simply looked at the master builder. "I am trying to keep my family warm, Silas, that is all." Silas shook his head, a deep sadness in his eyes. He saw a man blinded by a foolish idea, a man gambling with the lives of his family. He had done his duty as a neighbor. He could do no more. He turned and walked away, his verdict delivered. The community chorus followed his lead. The mockery intensified. Thorne's tomb was no longer a joke. It was starting to sound like a prophecy. Inside, Elias ignored them. He continued his work, his focus absolute. He packed the interior walls until they were smooth and hard. Then, he began building the most critical feature, the sleeping platform. Using packed snow, he constructed a wide shelf 2 feet off the main floor that wrapped around 2/3 of the interior chamber. This would be their living space. The floor below would collect the cold air, but up on the platform, they would live in the stratified layer of warmth. He covered the platform with a thick mattress of pine boughs to provide further insulation from the snow, and then laid their thickest buffalo hides on top. Finally, using a long pole, he poked a small, fist-sized hole through the apex of the dome. This was the chimney and the window, the crucial ventilation that would allow moisture and smoke to escape, ensuring the air inside remained fresh and dry. He built a small, raised hearth for their tiny stove near the entrance, ensuring the smoke would have a direct path to the vent. The system was now complete. Now, it was not just a pile of snow. It was a machine for living. It was an engine designed to capture and preserve heat with ruthless efficiency. The thick, air-filled walls were the insulation, a blanket woven from winter itself. The sunken entrance was the heat trap. The raised platform was the living zone. And the ventilation hole was the lung, allowing the structure to breathe. By the first week of December, as the temperature began its relentless slide toward zero, Elias Thorne moved his wife, Anna, and their children, Samuel and Alara, out of their cold, drafty log cabin and into the heart of the snow. December arrived with a quiet, menacing cold. The temperature hovered in the single digits, and the sun was a pale, distant disk that offered no warmth. For the residents of Providence Gulch, the familiar rhythms of the siege began. The sound of axes echoed through the frozen air from dawn till dusk. Smoke plumed constantly from their stone chimneys, a desperate signal of life and a testament to the furious rate at which they consumed their fuel. Then, in the second week of the month, the world changed. A weather system born in the Siberian Arctic descended upon the continent and slammed into the Rocky Mountains. It was a wave of cold so profound, so absolute, that it felt like a geological event. The old-timers would later call it the Great Freeze of '71. It was the kind of event that appears in the record books once a century. The temperature at dawn on the first day was 10 degrees Fahrenheit. By sunset, it was -5. The next morning, it was -22. The wind picked up, a scouring, relentless gale that drove the cold into every conceivable crack and crevice. The fine, dry snow it carried was more like sand, piling into immense drifts that buried cabins up to their rooflines. The world was reduced to a maelstrom of white and a terrifying, soul-crushing cold. For the families in their log cabins, life became a singular, desperate focus, feeding the fire. Woodpiles that had been meant to last until February were vanishing at an alarming rate. Men wrapped their faces in wool and braved the screaming wind and blinding snow to get to their woodpiles, often having to tunnel their way out of their own homes. The logs, frozen solid, were brittle as glass and shattered under the axe. Inside, the battle was being lost. Despite fires stoked to roaring intensity, the indoor temperatures plummeted. Water froze solid just a few feet from the hearth. Potatoes stored in the cellars turned to icy rocks. Families abandoned all pretense of normal life, pulling their beds as close to the fireplace as they dared, huddling together under every blanket and hide they owned. The cabins, once a symbol of security, had become wooden refrigerators, barely staving off the lethal cold. Reports, shouted from one buried cabin to the next during brief lulls in the wind, were grim. The Fletchers had lost half their cattle, frozen solid in their lean-to. Young Thomas Miller had gotten frostbite on his hands just running to the outhouse. The air itself seemed to steal the breath from your lungs, a sharp, searing pain with every inhalation. Fear, cold and quiet, began to settle over the valley. This was not a normal winter. This was an extinction-level event. Silas Blackwood, in his own cabin, the best built in the entire gulch, felt the cold as an affront to his craft. He had hand-scribed every log, packed every joint with moss and mud until it was airtight. His fireplace, built of river stone he had shaped himself, drew perfectly. By all rights, his family should have been secure, but they were not. He was burning through his wood at a rate that terrified him. His wife and 3 daughters were huddled by the fire, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. The north wall of his cabin, the one that faced the full fury of the wind, was coated in a thick layer of interior frost. a testament to the sheer volume of heat being leached out through the solid wood. His expertise was useless. His certainty had become his prison. He had built the strongest possible fortress, but the enemy was simply too powerful. His craft, his entire life's work, was failing before his eyes. And in the midst of his own fear and frustration, a new, darker thought began to trouble him. He thought of Elias Thorne. He pictured the man's family, entombed in that mound of snow. He had mocked the man's folly, but now a chilling sense of responsibility crept over him. What if the structure had already collapsed? What if they were buried alive, slowly freezing in the dark? The community had laughed, but no one had intervened. Did he, Silas, the community leader, stand by while a man's pride killed his family? The thought was unbearable. He had to know. By the fourth day of the storm, the temperature had reached an almost incomprehensible 38 degrees below zero, not accounting for the wind that made it feel like 100 below. It was in this lethal landscape that Silas Blackwood made his decision. He pulled on every layer of clothing he owned, wrapped his face until only his eyes were visible, and told his wife he was going to check on the Thornes. Her plea for him to stay was lost in the howl of the wind as he pushed his way out the door. The journey was a nightmare. The 100 yards from his cabin to Thorne's claim felt like a polar expedition. The wind was a solid wall, threatening to knock him off his feet with every step. The air was so cold it burned his lungs, each breath a conscious and painful effort. Snow, as fine and sharp as dust, blasted his exposed eyes. He navigated by memory, his world a blinding, roaring whiteness. He thought more than once of turning back, convinced the effort was a fool's errand that would only cost his own life. But the image of Thorne's two small children, cold and frightened in the dark, pushed him forward. He was moving through a world not meant for human life. And as he prepares to discover the truth inside that mound of snow, I want you to hit that like button right now if you believe that sometimes the craziest ideas are the only ones that work. He almost missed it. The snow dome was so blasted with drifts that it had become part of the landscape, nearly invisible. What caught his eye was a faint, almost imperceptible plume of vapor rising from the peak of the mound. It was a sign of life, but what kind? He stumbled towards it, his heart pounding with a mixture of dread and grim anticipation. He found the entrance, a small, dark hole nearly drifted over. He had to clear it with his hands, his fingers already numb and clumsy inside his thick mittens. He crouched down and crawled into the narrow, downward-sloping tunnel. The wind immediately ceased. The silence was absolute and unnerving. The tunnel was dark and smelled of cold earth and snow. It was like entering a barrow. He crawled for 10 feet, his mind bracing for what he would find. A frozen family, huddled together in a final desperate embrace. He was preparing himself to witness the tragic, inevitable conclusion to Thorne's folly. Then the tunnel turned upwards, and he felt it. It was not a blast of heat, not a fire's warmth. It was a gentle, pervasive pressure of warmth. It was as if the air itself had substance, a soft, enveloping medium that pushed back against the invasive cold that clung to his clothes. It was the most shocking sensation of his life. He crawled the last few feet and pushed his head and shoulders up into the living chamber. The scene that greeted him shattered his entire understanding of the world. He was looking into a small, circular room with walls that shimmered a soft, translucent white in the light of a single, placidly burning oil lamp. But it was the life within the room that struck him dumb. Anna Thorne was humming quietly to herself, kneading dough on a small wooden board. She was in her shirt sleeves. On the raised sleeping platform, covered in thick furs, her 2 children, Samuel and Alara, were playing with small wooden toys. They were barefoot, barefoot. The word echoed in Silas's mind. His own children were currently wearing 3 pairs of wool socks and were still complaining of cold feet, not 10 feet from a blazing fire. Here, in a house made of snow, in the middle of the worst storm in living memory, were barefoot children, comfortable and warm. There was no frost on the walls. There was no desperate shivering. Steam rose from a small pot of stew simmering on the tiny stove. The air was warm, dry, and fresh. It was a scene of impossible, unbelievable, domestic tranquility. He had crawled from a frozen hell into a secret summer. He pulled himself fully into the chamber, his mind struggling to process the sensory data that contradicted a lifetime of experience. Elias Thorne looked up from where he was mending a harness and nodded a simple greeting. "Silas, it's a bad storm." Silas could only stare, his mouth agape. He slowly, numbly pulled off a mitten. He reached out and touched the wall. He had expected it to be wet, or at least brutally cold. It was neither. The hard-packed snow was bone-dry and felt almost neutral to the touch, barely cool. He could feel no draft. He looked up at the small ventilation hole in the ceiling, seeing the vapor from their breath and the stove rising in a steady, gentle stream. He was a master builder, and he began to analyze the structure not with a skeptic's eye, but with a craftsman's. He saw the perfect curve of the dome. He understood, in a sudden, blinding flash, the function of the cold sink he had just crawled through. He saw the genius of the raised platform. It was a complete, perfectly functioning system. His gaze fell on the small pile of firewood next to the stove. It was tiny. It was a pathetic, absurdly small amount of wood. His own family had burned more than that in the last 3 hours. The final pieces of his disbelief crumbled. This was the data. This was the inarguable, irrefutable proof. "Elias," Silas began, his voice raspy and tight with emotion, "how much wood have you burned since the storm began?" Elias considered the question for a moment. "That stove is very small," he said. "We use it mostly for cooking. Perhaps a quarter of a cord? Maybe less. The lamp and our own bodies provide most of the heat." A quarter of a cord. The number hit Silas Blackwood like a physical blow. A quarter of a cord in 4 days. He had burned nearly 2 full cords. The Thornes were using less than 10% of the fuel of any other family in the valley, and yet they were immeasurably warmer, safer, and more comfortable. The numbers were not just undeniable. They were revolutionary. They were a verdict on everything he thought he knew. He looked at Elias, then at Anna and the 2 children, safe and warm in their impossible snow house. The full weight of his arrogance, of the whole community's blind, mocking certainty, fell upon him. He felt a profound and burning shame. He had not come here to find a miracle. He had come expecting to find a tragedy he could feel smugly superior about. He met Elias's calm, unwavering gaze. The man was not gloating. There was no hint of "I told you so" in his eyes. There was only a quiet, powerful dignity. "Elias," Silas said, and his voice broke. He had to clear his throat and start again. "I was wrong." He said the words clearly, leaving no room for doubt. "I was completely and utterly wrong. This is the warmest house in the valley. I have never been so wrong about anything in my entire life. You have to teach me. You have to teach us all how this is done." When the great freeze of 71 finally broke, it left a devastated landscape in its wake. The official temperature in Denver, 100 miles away and at a much lower elevation, had been recorded at -45 degrees. In Providence Gulch, it had certainly been far colder. The storm had taken a brutal toll. Dozens of cattle were lost. Several people suffered severe frostbite, and tragically, The miller's youngest child succumbed to the lung fever Silas had feared. The community emerged from their cabin shaken, depleted, and humbled by the power of the mountain winter. But as they began to take stock of their losses, a new story began to circulate. It started with Silas Blackwood. He told anyone who would listen what he had seen inside Thorne's tomb. He described the barefoot children, the shirt-sleeved mother, the dry, comfortable warmth. He talked about the tiny woodpile. Coming from any other man, the story would have been dismissed as a fever dream, a hallucination brought on by the cold. But this was Silas Blackwood, the master builder, the most practical and respected man in the Gulch. His testimony was unassailable. His conversion was total and zealous. He became the innovation's most important champion. He used his credibility not to save his own pride, but to shatter the community's. He publicly recounted his own foolishness, his own arrogant dismissal of Elias's idea. He made it clear that their survival had been a matter of luck, while the Thorne family's survival had been a matter of superior engineering. Curiosity turned to awe. The derisive nickname Thorne's tomb vanished from their vocabulary overnight. It was replaced with a new name, spoken with a sense of wonder: the Snow House. One by one, then in small groups, the men of the valley made the walk up to Elias Thorne's claim. They came not to mock, but to learn. They stood awkwardly at the entrance to the snow dome, their hats in their hands, their faces a mixture of shame and desperate curiosity. Elias, for his part, sought no apology and held no grudges. He was not a man built for pride. He was a man built for solving problems. He welcomed them all, patiently explaining the principles he had learned so long ago in the far north. He showed them the importance of sintering, the physics of the cold sink, the critical function of the raised platform, and the ventilation hole. He shared his knowledge freely, without any sense of triumph. He was simply a man helping his neighbors survive. The following autumn, the landscape of Providence Gulch looked different. Alongside the traditional work of chinking logs and stacking wood, a new activity took place. Under the guidance of Elias and the enthusiastic supervision of Silas, several families began constructing their own snow houses. They built them not as primary residences, but as emergency shelters, a backup for when the winter turned truly vicious. The crazy idea had become the new standard for preparedness. The real impact was not measured in degrees or cords of wood saved, though those numbers were significant. It was measured in the quiet confidence that settled over the community. The fear of winter, that constant nagging dread, was lessened. They had a new weapon in their arsenal, a secret wrested from the cold itself. It was measured in the winter of 1872, when two families, their cabins buried by an avalanche, survived for a week in a hastily dug snow shelter until they could be rescued. It was measured in the fact that for the next decade not a single child in Providence Gulch was lost to lung fever. It was measured in human dignity, in the simple ability to live, not just survive, through the darkest months of the year. The story of Elias Thorne and his snow house is a powerful reminder of a timeless truth. It demonstrates how often entrenched tradition can be a barrier to life-saving innovation. The settlers of Providence Gulch were not foolish. They were simply blinded by their own experience. They trusted what had always worked and could not conceive of a reality where their greatest enemy, the snow, could be their greatest ally. Their dismissal of Elias's idea was rooted in common sense, but it was a common sense that was fatally incomplete. Elias's wisdom came from his willingness to learn from a different culture, to accept knowledge that ran counter to his own upbringing. The Inuit had spent millennia perfecting a science of survival in the harshest environment on Earth. Elias was wise enough to see the genius in their methods and humble enough to adopt them. He faced mockery and isolation, not with anger, but with a quiet, unshakable confidence in the physical principles he had witnessed firsthand. It took the crucible of a once-in-a-generation crisis to prove him right, but when the proof came, it was absolute and undeniable. This principle, the use of trapped air within a material as insulation, is not some forgotten primitive trick. It is the fundamental concept behind nearly all modern insulation technologies, from the fiberglass in our walls to the foam in our winter coats. The snow house was, in its own way, a perfect passive structure, using its form and materials to maintain a habitable environment with minimal energy input. Elias Thorne, the quiet innovator, had built a home that was generations ahead of its time. If this story of forgotten wisdom and vindication resonated with you, hit that like button to help spread it. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of how historical ingenuity solved problems we still face today, and drop a comment below telling us what piece of old-fashioned ballweed advice have you found to be surprisingly effective in your own life. The story you have just heard is a fictionalized account, created for educational and entertainment purposes. While the characters and specific events are products of imagination, the scientific principles of snow shelter construction, including the insulating properties of snow, sintering, cold sinks, and ventilation, are based on real, established physics and historical indigenous practices. This content does not constitute professional survival advice,